So please open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 21. And we're going to begin at the 5th verse. Now, just to give you a little bit of backdrop, I want to remind you that this book was written by Luke, sometimes called the physician. Yes. And the period of this writing is in the first century. And so I want you to consider that as we go through Luke chapter 21, that you put on the mind of a first century disciple of Christ. Because what you're going to find in Luke 21 is a conversation that is taking place exclusively with Jesus and his disciples. I know that there's some of us who consider ourselves disciples of Christ. Well, the disciples that I'm making reference to are the disciples of the first century. Okay? Not us, but the first century disciples or the church of Jesus. So, we begin at the 5th verse.
Then, as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, "These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down."
Okay. So, you immediately, you're able to make that determination. And it doesn't take deep discernment to realize this, that this conversation is between Jesus and his disciples. Then as some spoke of the temple, that some is the disciples, okay? And then it says that they pointed out to the Lord the beauty of the temple. And then the Lord answers and he says in verse 6, "These things which you see." So what did his disciples see? The temple. They saw the temple and they were pointing out its beauty to the Lord. So Jesus says, "These things which you, the disciples, see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." And notice that he did not say that they would actually see the destruction of the temple. He pointed out to them, the temple that you see shall be destroyed. Okay? But he does not say, and this is very important, because in order for you to follow Luke 21, you need to realize that this is a conversation exclusively between Jesus and his disciples. Okay? Go ahead.
So they asked him, saying, Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?
Okay, so the disciples are asking Jesus, when will these things be? What things? The destruction of the temple. Okay? So they're asking Jesus, when will these things be? And what sign? They're asking Jesus for a sign that they will see, or what sign will there be when these things are about to take place, when the temple is to be destroyed? What signs? They're asking for signs. And Jesus answered.
And he said, Take heed that you not be deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time has drawn near. Therefore, do not go after them. But when you hear of wars...
Okay, just stop right there.
Okay.
So Jesus warns his disciples. Now the warning is to his disciples. The warning is not to all peoples. It is to his disciples, those who believe in him. Okay? Now, he says to them that there's going to be many false Christs. And they will say some convincing things to prove that they are the Christ. But Jesus says, no, don't be taken away by them. Don't follow them. Then he says, go ahead.
But when you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified. For these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately.
All right. So Jesus adds that when you hear of wars and commotions, don't be terrified. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Don't be frightened. Don't be alarmed, thinking that because of the rumors of war and of the commotions that are taking place, and that's the commotion of the of war. He says, don't be terrified. He said, the end is not. The end is not.
Yeah.
Thank you. But he says, don't be terrified, for the what?
These
These things that must come to pass.
Okay, so these things, the war, the rumors of war and commotions, these things must come to pass. But, he says, the end will not come immediately. So, for instance, the present time, you know the situation is very hostile in the Middle East. You know, there's war among the folks of the same nation, and you have an oppressive government, and you have folks that are in opposition, and they are at war, like in Syria, or Iran, and other countries. The prophets, or the so-called prophets of the doom and gloom theology, they get excited. They say, oh, look, Iran, they're setting up for a nuclear war, and they're going to nuke Israel. And so they say, well, this must be a sign of the end. That once they release their nuclear bombs, it's going to be the end of all things. And so the coming of the Lord is soon. But what does Jesus say? He says, you will hear of rumors of war and commotions, but don't be terrified. Okay? Don't be a prophet of the doom and gloom theology. Jesus said these things must come to pass. But, he says, the end will not come immediately. Relax, folks. You know, relax. But you see, the problem with the doom and gloomers is this, that anytime that there's any kind of activity down in the Middle East, they announce to the world that this is the end. Jesus is coming soon. And when the world doesn't see this coming to pass, they'll say, these guys are just a bunch of Looney Tunes. They've been making the same announcement for centuries now. Every time that there's rumors of wars, and they're yelling and they're shouting that, whoa, this is the end. But not so. Jesus said, no, these things must come to pass. But the end will not come immediately. All right? So, in other words, relax. You know, don't get excited and start telling everybody that, oh yeah, this is the sign. This is the sign of the end. Because there are going to be rumors of war or war and commotion. Today and tomorrow. So, you know, they say, don't jump the gun. Yeah, don't jump the gun. Wait for the facts. Wait for the things or the signs that Jesus says. Okay? Go ahead.
Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences. And there will be fearful signs and great signs from heaven.
Okay. All those things will take place. Because Jesus said that nations will rise against nations and kingdoms against kingdoms. And he says that there will be great earthquakes in various places. and there'll be famines and pestilence. Well, the famines and pestilence would be the result of a war. Those things are happening now. Take Syria, for example. You know, the victims of the war are experiencing famine and pestilence. Those two things are packaged in with the war. Now, when these things take place, Jesus says it will take place after certain other things or other events. So before the actual nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom and the famines and the pestilence and the great earthquakes in various places, before those things take place, Sister Mary, would you read that?
But before all these things, they will lay hands on you and persecute
so stop
you.
right there. So Jesus says, before all these things. So in other words, before all these things, the nation rising against nation, famines, pestilence, and various earthquakes, he says something is going to happen to his disciples. So before those things take place, his disciples are going to go through tribulation. And the tribulation that they will be going through, Sister Mary will read some of it for you.
They will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake.
Stop right there. So if you know the story of the Apostle Paul, you know that he himself lived through this type of persecution. That he was arrested and imprisoned, and then he spoke the gospel to the kings and to rulers. Go ahead.
But it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist.
Okay, so you're hearing some of the tribulations that they will go through. Verse 16, he says, again, you, his disciples, you, okay?
You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience, possess your souls.
Okay, so again, as you're following along, the warning that Jesus is given to his disciples. And you will see that the disciples are referred to as you. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. In other words, his disciples will go and be witnesses of Christ. His disciples will go and preach and teach and share the gospel. And they will be hated. As you can see, if you read the letters and the book of Acts, you'll see the persecution that the Christians had endured. However, it should not sound strange because Jesus here is already warning his disciples of those things which are to come for his name's sake. Okay? The persecution will be because for his name's sake. Not persecution because of the way you look, the way you talk, the way you dress, the way you behave at work or whatever. That's a personal persecution. He's not referring to that. He's referring to being persecuted for his name's sake. Okay? There's a big difference there. Personal persecution, you can make adjustments. You can adjust your behavior and then the persecution will stop. But that persecution for the Lord's name's sake, some folks in the first century church, they gave their lives while they were being persecuted. They were ordered to bow down to Caesar and call Caesar God. And those who refused, because of their conviction for the Lord, they were put to death. They died as martyrs. So there is a difference of personal persecution and being persecuted for the Lord's name's sake. Go ahead.
But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
Okay, so yes, Jerusalem was trampled. The temple was trampled. It was destroyed. Jerusalem was desolated. In 66 AD, there was a revolt that took place, and it was the Jews who revolted against the Roman army who were occupying Jerusalem. They succeeded, and they overthrew the Roman occupiers, and they in turn formed their own government. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, he continues and he says that in 70 AD, Jerusalem was overtaken and desolated. Now, Jesus said, and he warns, he's warning only his disciples. He's not warning the whole Jewish population. He's not warning the world. He's warning his disciples. And he said, when you see the armies, the Roman armies surround the city, Jerusalem. He says, when you see that taking place or about to take place, he said, flee to the mountains. Find refuge up in the mountains. Go up there and hide yourselves. And he said, if you're out in the country, don't travel to Jerusalem. But if you're in Jerusalem, when you see Jerusalem about to be surrounded, leave immediately. Go. For there shall be a desolation that will take place. Now, in 70 AD, at the time that Jerusalem was desolated, Josephus writes a few things about the events of that time. And he says that during Passover, there were thousands of Jews from various neighboring countries who visited Jerusalem for the Passover. Now, the Roman armies were already around, but they allowed these Jewish pilgrims to go into Jerusalem so that they could partake of the Passover. Or so the Jews thought. However, what Titus and his army, what they had in mind was, we'll let these thousands and thousands of Jews enter Jerusalem, and then we'll lock them in. We will not allow anyone to come out. They would be locked in or imprisoned in Jerusalem. And they had a plan, and they figured that Jerusalem had food and had drink to sustain the people, the local residents, for maybe a couple months. But now what happened with the added amount of visitors for the Passover, and remember, they were locked in. The food supply soon disappeared. It disappeared. And what do you think happened? They couldn't escape because the Roman army was outside. So without food, what happens? You starve and you die. And there were hundreds of thousands of Jews who died in that manner of starvation. I mean, things were getting so bad in Jerusalem that some of them became cannibalistic, just out of desperation. And Josephus says that the amount of people that died, he said, was so numerous that they couldn't bury them. So they ended up making a pile of dead bodies. Can you imagine? Josephus says that about 1.1 million Jews perished. Now, the Christians, or disciples of Christ, as they were referred to, disciples of Christ, they weren't in that number. Where were they when all of these things happened? They were up in the mountains.
They fled.
See? They were up in the mountains. God gave them refuge. Okay? So some folks will say, hey, when the tribulation takes place and the wrath of God follows, how is God going to protect us, Christians? And some will say, oh, well, God will rapture you before the tribulation or after the tribulation. God's going to rapture you so you don't have to go through the tribulation and the wrath of God. But read Matthew 24:29. Matthew says, after the tribulation of those days, what the disciples are going to see is they will see the wrath of God. What does that tell us? That they will see the wrath of God, and soon after the wrath of God will be the coming of the Son of Man. And that the disciples will see the coming of the Son of Man after the wrath of God. So what does that indicate? It indicates that the disciples are going to go through the tribulation and the wrath of God. Yeah. God will protect them. Well, how's God going to protect them? Look, he protected the disciples from the massacre that took place in Jerusalem.
That's right.
You know, he did it. Well, what about those 10 plagues that God placed upon Egypt? What about when God sent the angel of death to strike the firstborn? All firstborn. How did God protect the Jews? By placing the blood of what is now called the Passover lamb.
Yes.
Placing it at the entrance, the doorway. And any Jew who had anointed their doorposts and the lintels with the blood of that lamb, they were protected from the angel of death. When the angel of death saw the door smeared with the blood of the lamb, he went over. He passed on by. That's why it's called the Passover. He passed over.
Amen.